The fluorescent hum of the office always felt like a low, persistent thrum inside my skull, a subtle vibration that matched the constant underlying tension in my chest. My name is Marla Hayes, and I am, or at least I was, a 29-year-old marketing strategist living in the quiet, artistic city of Asheville, North Carolina. For years, I'd learned to navigate the subtle currents of corporate life, to observe without drawing attention, to listen more than I spoke. It was a skill honed not by choice, but by necessity, particularly under the shadow of a previous superior, a man named Marcus Thorne. He was the kind of person who could charm the birds from the trees while simultaneously cutting the branch you were sitting on. My office was on the third floor of Sterling and Finch, a mid-sized public relations firm nestled among the bustling streets and mountain views. I loved Asheville, its vibrant art scene, the way the Blue Ridge Mountains seemed to cradle the city, but the office itself often felt like a cage, particularly when Marcus Thorne was still my direct manager. He had this unsettling way of taking my ideas, presenting them as his own, and then, with a disarming smile, he would subtly undermine my confidence during team meetings. He'd suggest that my youthful enthusiasm sometimes outpaced my practical application, or he'd praise my raw talent while simultaneously stripping away the credit for the very work that demonstrated that talent. It wasn't outright malice, not in a way you could easily report, but a slow, insidious erosion of my professional worth. Every project I presented, every innovative concept I brainstormed, seemed to end up molded into his vision, his victory. It was a silent, suffocating torment that left me feeling invisible, unheard, and perpetually underestimated. I had learned to channel that quiet fury, to turn it inward, letting it simmer into a cold, methodical resolve. Marcus had since moved up, taking on a more executive role within the company's corporate communications department, no longer my direct superior, but still very much present, his influence still rippling through the corridors. He was now practically untouchable, a golden boy with a spotless reputation among the upper echelons, all built on a foundation of stolen ideas and stifled careers, mine included. The sight of him striding confidently through the office, his expensive suits tailored to perfection, his laugh echoing a little too loudly, always ignited that familiar spark of resentment deep within me. He was still reaping the rewards of his deception, and I was still carrying the quiet burden of his injustices. I kept my head down, worked diligently under Mrs. Albright, my current, infinitely more reasonable superior, and observed, always observed. The spark that truly ignited my journey, the one that turned passive observation into active planning, happened on a Tuesday during a particularly chaotic morning in the bullpen. It wasn't about me at all, but about a young intern named Chloe and a notoriously unpleasant mid-level manager named Mr. Henderson. Henderson was a petty tyrant, the kind of man who would correct your grammar in front of clients or demand coffee refills with an imperious flick of his wrist. Chloe, usually a picture of quiet diligence, had clearly reached her breaking point after Henderson had publicly ridiculed her formatting skills on a presentation she'd worked on all weekend. She looked pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, but there was a flicker in her eyes I recognized, a quiet, simmering rage. That afternoon, Henderson was about to present the same, now corrected, document to a potential client. As he reached for his meticulously organized notes, a fine, almost imperceptible shimmer caught the light. It wasn't much, just a dusting, but it was unmistakably glitter, iridescent, microscopic specks clinging to his papers, his fingers, even his perfectly coiffed hair. Henderson, oblivious at first, began his presentation. But as he gestured, as he flipped pages, more and more of the tiny particles drifted onto the conference table, settled on the client's dark suit, and glistened on the rim of his own water glass. The client, a stern, no-nonsense CEO, kept subtly brushing at his sleeve, a faint look of amusement mixed with confusion on his face. Henderson, noticing the odd glint, looked down, then up, his confidence visibly deflating as he realized he was quite literally sparkling. His face, already red from exertion, turned a deeper shade of crimson. It wasn't damaging, not really, but it was ridiculous. It was humiliating in a way that official reprimands could never be. Chloe, sitting discreetly in the corner, was barely concealing a triumphant smirk. The glitter, I later learned, had come from a forgotten craft project in the break room, applied to Henderson's pen in a moment of brilliant, petty inspiration. It was genius. It was subtle. It was utterly untraceable. Watching Chloe, watching Henderson, a switch flipped inside me. My revenge against Marcus Thorne had always felt like an abstract, impossible concept. How do you punish someone who leaves no fingerprints, whose cruelty is so insidious it's almost polite? But Chloe's glitter, so small, so utterly harmless, yet so effective in its quiet humiliation, showed me a path. It wasn't about grand gestures or public confrontations. It was about disruption, about erosion, about using subtlety to dismantle a carefully constructed facade. Marcus Thorne thrived on his immaculate reputation, on the perception of his brilliance and integrity. What if I could chip away at that, piece by tiny, undetectable piece, until the entire edifice crumbled? I began to think differently. My focus shifted from merely surviving his corporate maneuvers to understanding them, to cataloging them, to learning how to turn his own tactics against him. I started by revisiting old projects, old emails, old meeting notes. I meticulously reconstructed timelines, noted every instance where my ideas had been subtly repurposed, every time my contributions had been downplayed. It was a painful exercise, reliving those moments of quiet frustration, but it also solidified my resolve. This wasn't just about me, it was about every junior associate Marcus had ever stepped on, every idea he had ever claimed. I realized that my quiet nature, my tendency to observe and analyze, could be my greatest weapon. I was perceptive, I was methodical, and I was, at my core, quietly vindictive. This isn't just a story about me or about Marcus Thorne. It's a story about how the quietest among us can find their voice and their power in the most unexpected ways. If you find yourself enjoying this tale of calculated comeuppance, then I highly recommend you subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. You never know what kind of inspiration you might find there. Act 2 Struggle. The weeks that followed Chloe's glitter bomb incident transformed me. My quiet vindictiveness, once a simmering resentment, began to harden into a polished, strategic tool. I started carrying a small, leather-bound notebook disguised as a daily planner, in which I meticulously recorded every observation about Marcus Thorne. His habits, his favorite coffee order, the way he subtly cut off colleagues mid-sentence, his tendency to arrive just a few minutes late to meetings, yet still manage to appear perfectly composed. I noted his alliances, his rivalries, the unsaid tensions that hummed beneath the surface of office interactions. I was no longer just Marla Hayes, marketing strategist. I was Marla Hayes, strategic observer and orchestrator. My first real step in this meticulous campaign was to build a comprehensive psychological profile of Marcus. I didn't just remember the past, I delved into it. I reviewed every old project file where his name was linked to my work, every presentation slide where my concepts appeared under his name. I cross-referenced dates, internal email chains, and even the server logs to see who accessed what and when. Tedious, sometimes soul-crushing work, forcing me to relive the systematic erasure of my contributions. But with each piece of evidence I uncovered, the cold fire of my resolve burned brighter. I remembered his condescending smiles, the way he would lean back in his chair, fingers steepled, and declare my perfectly valid concerns overly emotional or lacking in corporate vision. I remembered the sting of those words, the feeling of my voice shrinking to a whisper. Now those memories fueled me. Marcus Thorne's most glaring weakness, I discovered, was his almost pathological need for external validation, especially from higher-ups, coupled with a deep-seated intellectual laziness that he disguised with bluster and vague corporate jargon. He was a master of talking a big game without doing the heavy lifting. He relied on others, then claimed their successes as his own. His reputation was built on smoke and mirrors, and a significant portion of my revenge would involve making those mirrors reflect a very different image. My plan began with subtle misdirection and the planting of informational seeds. I wasn't going to accuse him directly. That would be messy, easily dismissed, and frankly, too much like something Marcus himself would do, a direct attack with immediate, traceable consequences. No, my approach was far more insidious. I started by strategically overhearing conversations. For instance, I would linger near the break room when Marcus was there, and subtly direct a conversation with a colleague about the recent success of a project, casually mentioning how a particular innovative approach was such a brave move for a junior team member to suggest before Marcus really got behind it. The nuance was everything, a seemingly innocent comment that, to a perceptive listener, subtly implied the original idea wasn't his, but rather adopted by him. One of my initial, small triumphs involved a new software integration project. Marcus was leading the charge, but it was clear he was out of his depth. He relied heavily on a team of bright, young tech specialists and often made grand pronouncements without understanding the technical nuances. I started accidentally, leaving printed drafts of my old, detailed project proposals, ones that showed my original design concepts and intricate problem-solving methodologies, in highly visible places, the printer tray, a communal meeting room table, knowing that certain curious, well-placed individuals, particularly those under Marcus, would pick them up. These documents, dated years before, detailed solutions to problems that Marcus was now publicly struggling with. They weren't direct accusations, but they were undeniable proof of my prior, more thorough work. The goal wasn't for someone to immediately connect the dots and accuse him. It was to plant a slow-growing seed of doubt. The true genius of my plan, if I do say so myself, lay in its multi-pronged nature. I knew that one glitter pen moment wouldn't be enough to topple a man like Marcus Thorne. It had to be a series of continuous, almost imperceptible nudges, each one eroding a tiny piece of his carefully constructed facade. I used his own love of appearing busy against him. He was notorious for scheduling back-to-back meetings, often overlapping, and prided himself on his packed calendar. I started subtly me-sending meeting invites from an old, defunct internal account, invites for non-existent conferences or timed calls that would cause him to miss critical portions of actual important discussions. These were easy to dismiss as technical glitches, but they sowed tiny seeds of unreliability. "Oh, Marcus, you missed that crucial update again," a colleague might say, their tone just slightly tingling with exasperation. His usual excuse of being overbooked began to sound less like a testament to his importance and more like an excuse for disorganization. The challenges were constant. Marcus was cunning. He had spent years cultivating an image of competence and charm. There were moments when I felt the weight of my ambition, the sheer audacity of what I was attempting. Mrs. Albright, my current boss, a kind but astute woman, noticed my increased focus my late nights. "Marla," she'd say, her voice laced with concern, "you're burning the candle at both ends. Is everything all right?" I'd offer a tight smile and assure her I was just deeply invested in my work, learning everything I could. Her concern, though genuine, felt like a silent pressure, a potential obstacle if she ever suspected my true intentions. One particularly despairing evening, I found myself staring at the wall in my Asheville apartment, the city lights twinkling outside like distant, unsympathetic eyes. A knot of fear tightened in my stomach. What if I was caught? What if my quiet, methodical campaign was discovered? The humiliation would be catastrophic, my career utterly destroyed. It was one thing to be underestimated. It was another entirely to be branded a disgruntled schemer. Marcus, with his powerful connections, could crush me effortlessly. For a moment, just a moment, I considered abandoning it all, letting the resentment fester and fade. But then I thought of all the times he had stolen my thunder, all the hours I had poured into projects only for him to take the credit, all the times I had swallowed my pride and rage. No, I wouldn't give up, not now, not when I was so close to making him truly see himself. The very thought of his unearned success was enough to harden my resolve once more. I also began to cultivate relationships with junior team members, especially those who had recently joined and were still idealistic, perhaps a little naive and certainly impressionable. I didn't overtly gossip about Marcus, but I would subtly guide conversations towards the firm's history, praising the visionaries who had built certain departments, hinting at the true origins of long-standing successful campaigns Marcus often took credit for. I might say, Project Phoenix, the one Marcus always talks about. It was actually conceptualized by a team of interns back in 2017. Brilliant, truly brilliant. The key was never to explicitly state he had stolen credit, but to create a narrative that subtly shifted the spotlight away from him and onto the true originators. These young minds, eager to learn, absorbed these nuggets of company history and often, unknowingly, repeated them. My efforts extended to the company's internal social network. Marcus, like many senior executives, enjoyed posting professional updates, sharing articles, and taking credit for team successes. I, on the other hand, was a quiet observer, but now I used this to my advantage. I would subtly like and comment on old posts from other employees, especially those who had since left the company, resurrecting long-forgotten achievements. For instance, if Marcus posted about a new client win, I might like a post from 2 years ago by a former employee, celebrating the initial pitch that laid the groundwork for that very client relationship. It was a digital echo, a quiet reminder that the foundations of his success were often laid by others. These digital breadcrumbs were too small to be noticed by a casual observer, but for anyone looking closely, a pattern might begin to emerge. I had to be careful, meticulous, and patient. This wasn't about instant gratification. It was about the slow, deliberate dismantling of a reputation. If you're finding yourself as engrossed in this long game as I was, remember there are many more stories like mine. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. You won't want to miss the satisfying conclusions. Act 3: Revenge. The final act of my quiet vengeance unfolded over several months, culminating in a series of events that, to an outsider, would appear to be an unfortunate cascade of professional missteps on Marcus Thorne's part. To me, however, it was the meticulously orchestrated symphony of his unraveling, a testament to the power of perception and patience. My biggest gamble came with the firm's annual strategic review, a high-stakes event where department heads presented their past year's achievements and outlined future initiatives to the board of directors. Marcus, as the corporate communications lead, was expected to deliver a polished, insightful presentation showcasing his department's innovative contributions. This was his stage, his moment to shine, and he always approached it with a theatrical flair that masked his actual lack of original thought. I knew Marcus's process intimately. He would delegate the heavy research and data analysis to his team, then cobble together a high-level summary, embellishing it with grand, visionary statements. He rarely delved into the specifics himself, relying on others to catch any discrepancies. This was his critical vulnerability, and I was prepared to exploit it. My primary target for this phase was the upcoming innovation and growth proposal, a pet project of Marcus's that he planned to unveil at the review. He touted it as his brainchild, a bold new direction for the firm's client acquisition strategy. In truth, it was a rehash of several ideas, including some of mine that had been floated, rejected, and then quietly revived by Marcus with a new, flashy name. My job was to ensure that his presentation, while appearing technically sound, contained subtle, almost invisible, inconsistencies that would highlight his superficial understanding of the material. I began by befriending Sarah, a bright but overworked analyst on Marcus's team, who was tasked with compiling the crucial data for his presentation. Sarah was stressed, overwhelmed, and constantly battling Marcus's last-minute demands and vague instructions. I offered my help innocently at first, framing it as a desire to cross-pollinate ideas and ensure departmental synergy. I helped her streamline data, volunteered to proofread slides, and offered fresh eyes on his executive summary. Sarah, grateful for the assistance, welcomed my input, never suspecting my true agenda. Within the hundreds of data points and dozens of slides, I strategically introduced minute, almost undetectable errors. For example, a growth projection chart might have a key data point slightly off, not enough to be immediately obvious, but enough that anyone doing a thorough cross-reference would find a discrepancy. A client's quarterly engagement metric, while mostly correct, would have 1 month's percentage points subtly shifted, making the overall average appear marginally lower than it should be, or higher in a way that contradicted other internal reports. These weren't glaring mistakes. They were small, almost negligible inaccuracies that, if questioned, would require a deep dive into the raw data to confirm, something the board rarely did in real time. The purpose was to sow the seeds of doubt, to create a faint dissonance in the minds of anyone who truly understood the numbers. I also, with surgical precision, reintroduced old terminology into his innovative proposal. Words and phrases from my own, long-abandoned proposals, terms like synergistic client pathways or holistic engagement architecture, terms he had previously dismissed as unnecessarily academic. Now they were scattered throughout his presentation, presented as his cutting-edge insights. This was a direct echo of his past behavior, a subtle reminder of his intellectual theft, but only to those who had been present for the original discussions years ago. The board, unfamiliar with the firm's ancient internal debates, wouldn't notice, but a few long-serving senior managers might feel a flicker of recognition, a quiet sense of déjà vu. The day of the strategic review arrived with the oppressive weight of a summer storm. I was not presenting, but I was present, sitting quietly in the back row, observing my heart a drum against my ribs. Marcus, resplendent in a charcoal suit, began his presentation with his usual practiced charm, his voice booming with confidence. He hit all his marks, delivered his rehearsed jokes, and spun his narrative of innovation and growth. For the first 20 minutes, it was exactly as I predicted, a masterful performance of a man who knew how to talk the talk. But then Mrs. Albright, my current boss, a woman known for her sharp mind and meticulous attention to detail, began to ask questions. She wasn't aggressive, merely inquisitive. Marcus, she began, her voice calm, on slide 17, the projected client acquisition rate for Q3 seems slightly optimistic given the historical data. Could you elaborate on the factors contributing to that specific surge? Marcus, for the first time, faltered. He offered a vague, generalized response about market dynamics and aggressive outreach strategies. Mrs. Albright nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering, and then gently pointed out, yes, but the specific percentage you've listed there, 18.2%, contradicts the internal forecast from last month by nearly a full point. Is there a new variable I'm missing? A ripple went through the room. Marcus, caught off guard, stumbled, his confident facade cracking. He stammered something about a last-minute data refresh and deferred to Sarah, who looked as surprised as he did. The tiny, meticulously placed error had been found. It was a pinprick, not a wound, but it was enough to shift the atmosphere, to introduce a note of doubt. Later, one of the board members, a former marketing executive known for his memory of past campaigns, paused on a slide that prominently featured the phrase holistic engagement architecture. He leaned forward, a thoughtful frown on his face. Marcus, he asked, this phrase, holistic engagement architecture, it sounds familiar. Didn't we explore this concept a few years back, perhaps around the time Marla or Ms. Hayes joined the firm? His eyes drifted to me in the back row. Marcus visibly stiffened. He quickly countered, it's a foundational principle, sir, one we've been refining for years, a perennial concept, if you will. He tried to wave it away, but the seed was planted. The board member continued to eye him, a subtle flicker of suspicion in his gaze. He didn't accuse, he merely remembered, and in that memory, Marcus's claim to originality dissolved into thin air. The rest of the presentation limped to a conclusion. The board members, usually effusive in their praise for Marcus, were polite but distant. They thanked him, but there was an underlying coolness, a subtle lack of the usual warmth. The small errors, the rehashed terminology, the faint air of intellectual dishonesty, it all combined to form a picture that was just slightly off. It was the glitter effect, amplified and refined. His reputation wasn't shattered, but it was subtly tarnished, a faint haze of doubt clinging to it. The real payoff came in the weeks that followed. The innovation and growth proposal, once lauded, was quietly put on indefinite hold for further internal review. Projects Marcus had been vying for were suddenly assigned to others. His once frequent invitations to exclusive executive meetings dwindled. He wasn't fired, not yet, but he was sidelined. The carefully cultivated image of the brilliant, indispensable executive had been quietly, methodically dismantled. He was no longer the golden boy, he was merely competent, a bit unreliable, and perhaps a touch unoriginal. He became just another manager, no longer untouchable, his power base subtly eroded. I watched him, the change in him was gradual but undeniable. The confident stride became less pronounced, the booming laugh less frequent. He started to look tired, his eyes betraying a quiet anxiety he'd never shown before. He knew something was different, that the ground had shifted beneath his feet, but he couldn't pinpoint why. He probably blamed bad luck or new management or even the fickle nature of the corporate world. He never suspected the quiet, unassuming woman in the back row, the one he had so casually dismissed and undermined for years. The true satisfaction wasn't in seeing him publicly humiliated, but in watching him slowly lose his grip, understanding that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling from within piece by piece. It was the justice of 1,000 paper cuts, each one administered with precise intention. My revenge wasn't a roaring inferno. It was a slow, suffocating fog that enveloped him until he couldn't see his way out. My own career, ironically, began to flourish. With Marcus's influence waning, new opportunities opened up. Mrs. Albright, perhaps sensing the shift in the corporate landscape, perhaps impressed by my quiet diligence and suddenly more visible contributions, started giving me more responsibility, more direct client interaction. I found my voice, no longer shrinking under the shadow of a bully. I was still Marla Hayes, quiet and perceptive, but now I was also visible, respected, and undeniably thriving. It was bittersweet, I suppose. The years of quiet suffering, the meticulous planning, the constant vigilance, it had all taken a toll. But the taste of vindication, the knowledge that I had orchestrated justice on my own terms, was undeniably sweet. Marcus Thorne continued to work at Sterling and Finch, a diminished shadow of his former self, a cautionary tale whispered among the new hires who wouldn't quite understand why he never seemed to land the big projects anymore. And I, Marla Hayes, continued my work, stronger, smarter, and with a quiet understanding of the intricate dance of power. My story is just one among many, a testament to the fact that even the quietest among us can orchestrate the downfall of giants. If you've been on this journey with me, feeling every moment of frustration and satisfaction, then you know there are countless narratives of redemption and retribution waiting to be discovered. Subscribe to Tales of Revenge channel for new revenge stories daily. You never know when the next spark of inspiration or the next quiet act of defiance might ignite.